a single toll of the bell, and a body in the lantern room. Welcome to Echo Files. I am your host, Walter Finch. Share where you're listening from. Your stories make ours richer. Let's step into the mystery. The summer evening in St. Aldhelm's was one of those rare, perfect moments when the whole village seemed to exhale in contentment. The lanterns strung along the edges of the church green swayed gently in the warm breeze, their colored panes casting soft pools of light upon the lawn. It was the annual lantern room fete, named for the peculiar octagonal chamber atop the old church tower, where the parish stored its antique festival lamps and, for reasons lost to time, the more eccentric villagers insisted any committee meetings be held. The fete was a highlight of the summer calendar, a time for gossip in good humor, for lemonade and sponge cake, and for children to dart about with paper lanterns that made their faces glow like miniature saints in stained glass. Miss Jane Marple, seated comfortably on a wooden bench near the tea table, was not much for fetes, but she had been persuaded to attend by Mrs. Emmeline Carter, who had proclaimed in her usual bracing tone that one simply must support the church roof fund, Jane. So Miss Marple sat, her knitting in her lap, watching with quiet amusement as Mr. Alfred Penrose, the church warden, attempted to balance a large tray of scones while keeping his pince-nez in place. She noted how he managed the tray with exaggerated care, an almost theatrical display, and filed it away in that private mental ledger she kept of other people's little habits. The fete was in full swing when the bells tolled 7. From the lantern room above, the faint glimmer of a light shone through the small diamond-paned windows, though no one gave it a thought. The rector, Reverend Harold Simpkins, had been bustling between stalls earlier and was now said to have gone up to retrieve a set of the church's older lanterns for display. The music from the gramophone faltered for a moment, the needle skipping before finding its place again. It was a small thing, and yet, just as the record resumed, a sharp, singular cry echoed from somewhere above the green. It was not loud, not the sort of scream to send people running in terror, but it carried a note of sudden and unmistakable alarm. A moment later, the church bells began to toll again, 3 slow, solemn chimes. Though no one was pulling the ropes, Miss Marple's needles paused mid-click. People began glancing about, murmuring. Mr. Penrose stopped mid-sentence with Mrs. Carter, his eyes lifting toward the dark outline of the church tower. From one of the upper windows, the light in the lantern room flickered strangely, then went out. It was young Thomas Fletcher, the verger's nephew, who found the rector. The boy's face was pale as chalk when he appeared breathless at the fete, stammering that something terrible's happened, and that Mr. Simpkins he's not moving. There was an awkward, collective pause, people unwilling to take the words in. But Miss Marple, her expression unreadable, set down her knitting. The quiet murmur of a few seconds before had turned into a confused babble of voices, each person half whispering theories and questions. By the time Constable Briggs pushed through the gathering crowd toward the church, the fete's music had gone silent. The summer air, still warm and scented faintly with roses, now seemed to carry an undercurrent of something far colder. And up in the lantern room, though no one yet knew it, a murder had been committed. Miss Marple, adjusting her hat against the breeze, followed at a measured pace, her eyes taking in every shifting expression, every half-suppressed glance between the villagers. For it was in moments like this, she knew, that people's true selves began, ever so slightly, to show. Constable Briggs's boots made a dull, hollow sound on the stone steps as he ascended the tower, the kind of sound that could make even a sensible man imagine echoes that were not there. The verger, Horace Fletcher, went first with the keys, his nephew just behind, still ashen and shaky. The vicarage gardener, Mr. Kellaway, pressed a handkerchief to his nose and muttered about the smell of paraffin drifting down. Miss Marple did not hurry. She took each step with unassuming care, one hand lightly grazing the cold wall so that her senses could attend to the other things. The stale tang of old rope, the greasier note of brass polish caught in the cracks of the banister. And something else, faint and metallic, that might have been blood or simply well-used iron. When they reached the lantern room, the little octagonal chamber felt at once smaller than expected and oppressively full. It had a low wooden table where the old festival lamps, green, amber, ruby, were usually arranged in tidy rows. Now 2 lanterns stood toppled, one still smoldering faintly from a charred wick, its glass shattered in chips across the planked floor. Another lantern, a distinctive blue one with a fluted brass crown, was conspicuously missing from the table. In the corner, beneath the short, diamond-paned window, Reverend Harold Simpkins lay on his side, a dark spreading mat beneath his head where the floor met the wall. His collar was askew. The gentle, slightly fussy look that most people associated with him had left no trace on his waxy features. Briggs made a hoarse noise in the back of his throat and gripped the door frame as though the old wood could tell him what to do. "Right," he said, louder than necessary. "No one touch anything. Fletcher, stand clear. Tom, out with you. No, wait downstairs. I'll want a word in a minute." Thomas obeyed too readily. He kept his eyes on the scuffed toes of his shoes and skittered away, like a reprimanded schoolboy. Horace Fletcher leaned back against the wall, looking painfully upright and very old, his pride making a stoic mask of his fear. Mr. Alfred Penrose, who had pushed his way up despite Briggs's instruction to keep folks out, hovered near the threshold with his habitual air of conscientious intrusion. His pince-nez gleamed despite the low light. Mrs. Emmeline Carter followed. She would not, Miss Marple suspected, have missed the scene for anything, although she fanned herself with a program and looked ready to faint should the moment require it. "Stand back, Mrs. Carter," Briggs said more gently. "Please." Miss Marple took in the particulars with one steady glance. The rope that controlled the Sanctus bell ran through an iron ring at ceiling height before dropping to a cleat by the door. It had been looped twice round the cleat and then, oddly, knotted across itself in a way that spoke not of knee-jerk reaction, but of neat thinking. Someone who wanted the rope to hold steady once used. A smear of soot or oil marred the edge of the cleat. She noticed a small crescent of glass wedged between 2 floorboards near the rector's outstretched hand, and the faintest trace of wax. Blue, was it? Stuck to the hem of his cassock. "Poor man," Mrs. Carter whispered, producing smelling salts from the same cavernous handbag that earlier had emitted a raffle book and a length of bunting. "Do you think he fell?" "Given the angle of the head," Mr. Penrose said, with the unpleasant briskness of a man who employs certainty against fear, "and the broken glass, it looks rather more like he was struck." He swallowed. "Brass is heavy. Those old lanterns would, yes." Briggs crouched with awkward care beside the body. "No more talking than necessary," he said, "and no more theorizing. I'll fetch Dr. Markham. Nobody leaves the fete for now." He stood again, his face flushed. "Miss Marple, are you all right, miss?" "Oh, perfectly," said Miss Marple, who had seen dreadful things before, and worse in their pettier forms. "If I may, Constable, that window latch seems not properly set." She pointed, not touching. "One sees such things in cottages. The screw loosens and the catch slips. A gust might rattle it." Briggs squinted at the little window. "Doesn't look forced." "No," Miss Marple agreed mildly. It very seldom appears so when people go out of their way to make it seem as if something might have come from outside. Such efforts tend to be a shade too tidy. But of course, we must wait upon the doctor. Briggs blinked, processing only half of that. He moved to the door. "Fletcher, lock it. Give me the key. We'll go down and keep people calm." Horace Fletcher, with the air of a man obeying a sensible order in the only world he understands, the world of keys and sacred timings and tidy vestries, shut the lantern room door and turned the heavy key. Miss Marple watched where his gaze fell as he did so. Not on the body, not even on the toppled lanterns, but on the bell rope and its knot, the small, precise knot. The verger's mouth compressed. Miss Marple filed that away alongside another small observation. Mrs. Carter's white lace glove, which had been pristine earlier, now bore a faint smear near the thumb, as if she had steadied herself on something not quite clean. Below, on the green, the crowd had settled into the rhythmic churn of village crisis. Whispers, hearty denials, and the urgent manufacture of explanation. The gramophone had been silenced entirely. On a bench just off the path, Thomas sat with his arms wrapped round his middle, as if keeping his insides from spilling out. Miss Ivy Lark, the schoolmistress, had placed herself beside him and was speaking in an even tone about nothing. Lamps for the harvest festival, needlework, the correct stacking of hymnals. Anything that might place his mind on rails. Miss Marple approached unhurriedly. "Tom," she said, and the boy looked up, desperate for someone to tell him what to think. "You were a help to your uncle, weren't you, dear? Fetching and carrying." He nodded. "Uncle doesn't like the heights. My job to run things up when he needs 'em." "You went up just now," Miss Marple said, as if reminding herself of a matter concluded, "because you saw the light flicker." She let the sentence end there, invitational rather than interrogative. Tom blinked. "Well, yes, miss. Mr. Penrose said earlier the rector had gone up for the old lamp sets. Then Mrs. Carter asked if the blue one would be shown, the one what's always in the middle. And Uncle said, 'Later on, if there's time.' And then, right when the music hopped, the needle did that scratch. Someone tolled the bell 3 times. It didn't seem right. So I went." "Did you meet anyone on the stairs?" Miss Marple asked. Tom shook his head too quickly. "Number only the draft. It's queer up there. The door was—" He looked around, suddenly wary of saying the wrong thing. "Say it just as it was," Miss Marple said gently. "The door was on the latch. Uncle always keeps it locked when nobody's there. I pushed it and it went right in and—" He swallowed. "I saw him." Miss Lark, whose even voice hid a sharp mind, said quietly, "Tom came straight down. He didn't scream. I rather think that tells you everything about the boy's steadiness." "Thank you, Miss Lark," Miss Marple said, meaning it. "And where is Mr. Penrose now?" Miss Lark inclined her head toward the tea tent, where Mr. Penrose, his composure returned to the extent that he was rearranging cups, stood between 2 ladies and explained the proper order of notifying diocesan authorities when a clergyman died, as though a rota might presently be devised for grief itself. Mrs. Carter had taken up a station near the raffle table. She was whispering intensely to Mr. Kellaway, the gardener, who looked mulish and embarrassed. Miss Marple noted the way the lady's gloved hand landed, in emphasis, on his sleeve, the smear on the lace, the darker patch on Kellaway's cuff, as if transfer had been made from a place where soot and oil were in company. Dr. Markham's arrival produced a wave of expectation. Briggs, brisk with borrowed authority, went up again with him. The interval that followed was strange. The fates' ornaments hung bright and incongruous in the falling light. And the villagers, no matter how they pretended at normality, clustered toward the church like birds facing weather. Miss Marple stood by the old yew and thought of another village many years ago, where a locked storeroom door had been left on the latch for a very good reason, so that the right person would open it and be thought the first to arrive. People, she reflected, were never so clever as when they tried too hard to look uncalculated. When Briggs returned, his face had settled into lines of duty. "Dr. Markham says what looks obvious is likely so," he announced to those near enough to hear. "A blow to the head. We'll know more later. In the meantime, everyone kindly go on home. We'll be speaking to those who were closest, committee, verger, such like." Mrs. Carter put a hand to her throat. Poor Harold, so conscientious. And to think, up there alone. She dabbed at her eyes and found no tears. "Constable, I told him, we all told him, that the lantern room was no place for one's own company after dusk. It's oppressive." "It is what it is," Briggs said unhelpfully. "I'll take statements." Mr. Penrose straightened, glad to be required. "I can compile a list of committee members present and their occupations," he said. "One must always have order. The diocesan registrar will need accurate names." "Do that," Briggs said shortly. "Miss Marple, if you wouldn't mind." He looked almost apologetic, as though asking a retired gentlewoman to endure the bother of the world's complications. "I shall be very happy to tell you what little I saw," Miss Marple said. She watched his face, then glanced past him to where Horace Fletcher had stationed himself at the base of the tower, like a small, square sentinel before a place of sorrow. The verger held his cap tightly in both hands, the knuckles pale. A man concerned with propriety and little else might have stayed near the sacristy. A man guarding something would hold the ground itself. Under a canopy of dimming sky, people peeled away toward cottages lit with the first domestic lamps of evening. The air cooled and clarified. Miss Marple gave her account in a low, even voice. The music's brief falter, the bell's 3 chimes, the momentary flicker in the lantern room window, Thomas's announcement, the look on Mrs. Carter's glove, the knotting of the bell rope, the missing blue lantern. Briggs wrote carefully, underlining blue lantern, and staring at the word as though color itself were culpable. "Does it matter, the color?" he asked finally, rubbing his forehead. "It's only decoration, isn't it?" "Decoration has a way of being pointlessly particular when people are fond of rituals," Miss Marple said, not as correction, but as a thought about human habits. One notices when a favorite piece is absent, as Mrs. Carter did, and sometimes the most visible thing is what one places over something else. The way a bough covers an unsightly bend in the hedge. My neighbor Mrs. Hartnell once covered a crack in her parlor wall with a very pretty sampler. Visitors admired the sampler and never thought of asking why it had been hung there. Briggs looked at her as if he wanted to ask what she truly meant and whether it had already been said. He settled for, "You think someone brought the missing lantern down?" "To hide it." "To hide something about it," Miss Marple said gently. "If there is blue wax on the rector's hem, one wonders at the means by which such wax fell. Candle wax, for instance, usually requires heat and time. And yet I saw no candle burning when we went up." Briggs, to his credit, frowned like a man catching hold at last of an actual thread. "Right. The rope, too. Verger tied that?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Horace Fletcher ties knots like a sailor. That one was neat, yes, but not his way. A little too careful. People show themselves, you know, in the smallest things." Mr. Penrose earlier demonstrated a very conscientious manner of carrying a tray. One might even call it theatrical. Mrs. Carter touches many things with the air of someone accustomed to being permitted. And Miss Lark soothes in equal tones and watches with unequal eyes, her left eye on the child, her right on the door. "You think Miss Lark?" "I think, Constable," Miss Marple said, with a mildness that softened the truncation of conjecture, "that no one should be decided upon yet. In villages, accidents can be made and quarrels can be smoothed, all under the same set of lamps. But the rector, I believe, did not fall by his own carelessness. Someone desired that we think so. It is always a poor sign when thought is so earnestly directed in one path." A small, uncertain figure had hovered at the edge of their little clearing while they spoke. It was Beatrice Simpkins, the rector's sister and housekeeper, who had been missing from the green. She had come quietly in her gray shawl, face pinched, eyes bright with a sort of fierce comprehension one sees only the first hours after grief arrives before it becomes duller and colder. "May I see him?" she asked Briggs, chin lifted. "Not tonight, Miss Simpkins," Briggs said, as gently as a reluctant man could. "Tomorrow the doctor will—" "There are things—" "My brother," she said, not raising her voice, "was not a man to go climbing stairs in his good cassock for the sake of rummaging lanterns. He would ask for them, would send the verger. If he went, he was called. Someone called him up, Constable. Someone who knew which bell to ring." Miss Marple felt, rather than saw, the way the words landed. Called him up. The Sanctus bell's 3 solemn chimes, the smudge on the cleat, the missing blue lantern and its wax at the hem. It was not only an act of violence, but an act of theater, the sort that uses habit as stagecraft. People came when bells called. They always had. "Who would he go for?" Briggs asked, pen arrested over the page. Beatrice's mouth tightened. "For Mrs. Carter, for Mr. Penrose, for anyone who said it was for the church. But if you want a name—" She breathed out. "For Miss Lark. Because he worried about that girl she keeps lodging, Evelyn Sykes, the one who sings in the choir with a voice too big for her head. My brother was foolish about strays. He would go for a stray at any hour." A silence followed, not empty, but expectant. Miss Marple, who disapproved of silences being wasted, said, "We must allow that Miss Lark already had a stray beside her tonight, and she is as dutiful as any schoolmistress. Yet it is useful to know whom a summons would bring without hesitation." Briggs nodded, rubbing at the bridge of his nose. "All right. No one leaves the village till I say. Tomorrow morning, first thing, I'll speak to Miss Lark, Mrs. Carter, Mr. Penrose, the verger, and the girl, Evelyn Sykes. And I'll find that blue lantern if it's to be found. Do remember to look for something that is not a lantern," Miss Marple said, as if straying upon an odd homemade recipe. "Hidden perhaps in the place where one would naturally put a lantern down. People often slip the wrong object into the right container when they are hurried or frightened. I did once find a bottle of hair tonic tucked into a flour bin because Mrs. Price thought it had the same stout shape as her jar of baking powder." Briggs gave a sound that might have been a laugh in another man. "Right," he said again, with more purpose. "Right." They separated, much as villagers do when the day has become what no one wanted. Miss Marple turned toward the lane that led to her cottage, the path edged with tansy and pennywort that caught the last of the light. She did not walk quickly. Up in the dark silhouette of the tower, a room full of lanterns had flickered and gone out. And down here, on the green, the smaller lamps of habit were still burning. Cups stacked, bunting flapping listlessly, browned scones forgotten under a napkin. It is not a large step, she thought, between what people call tradition and what they allow to be done in its name. In that narrow space, harm often hides itself. As she reached the stile, she noticed, almost idly, a thin smear along the top rail, a streak of something that caught the light. She touched it with the slightest press of a fingertip and lifted her hand to the fading sky. Wax, yes, faintly blue. Someone had passed this way hurriedly, lantern or not lantern in hand, seeking the shortcut that led behind the vicarage hedge and round to the schoolhouse. Miss Marple sighed, a small, sorrowful sound for the inevitabilities of human behavior, and stepped down into the lane, where the night began to gather itself in earnest. The morning in St. Aldhelm's dawned with a thin mist that curled like pale smoke around the churchyard yews and lay low over the cobbled lanes. To anyone unfamiliar with the village, it might have seemed peaceful. But for those who had been at the Lantern Room fete the previous evening, the stillness carried a heavy, unspoken tension. Curtains twitched more than usual. Doors opened only far enough for a head to peer out before closing again. The church bells, normally rung for morning prayers, remained silent. Constable Briggs had ordered it so, out of some notion that the absence of their sound might keep gossip from becoming too shrill. Miss Marple was not one to let absence fool her. Silence could be just as revealing as noise. She sat at her kitchen table with a pot of tea, her knitting beside her, and reviewed the facts she had gathered. Not the police sort of facts with their neat labels, but the small and overlooked things that to her mind were more reliable. The missing blue lantern, the neat but unfamiliar knot in the bell rope, the flicker of light before it went out, Mrs. Carter's gloved hand with its smear, and the faint wax stain on the stile toward the schoolhouse path. She did not yet know which detail would open the whole matter, but she was certain that when it came, it would not be from a confession in the village square. Her thoughts were interrupted by a brisk knock at the door. It was Briggs, looking as though the night had given him little rest. He stood awkwardly on the mat, cap in hand. "Morning, Miss Marple. Sorry to trouble you so early." "You're not troubling me, Constable," she said, ushering him in. "You'll have some tea?" He accepted, perching on the very edge of the chair. "I've begun taking statements. The verger says he never leaves the Lantern Room door unlocked, not even for the rector, without himself being there. Says last night was the first time in 20 years anyone found it on the latch." He frowned. "Mrs. Carter swears she never went up. Penrose says the same. Miss Lark, well, she claims she was with the boy Thomas the whole time. The girl Evelyn Sykes, she says she didn't even go near the tower, kept to the cake stall. But—" He hesitated. "Dr. Markham says the rector was struck with something blunt and heavy, likely from behind. Could have been one of those old lanterns. The blue one's still missing." Miss Marple poured his tea as though she were merely listening to a story about the weather. "And has the rope been examined?" He shook his head. "Not yet. Thought to leave it till we'd searched for the lantern." "It may not be the lantern itself you're looking for," she said gently. "Objects can be disguised as other things or used for purposes other than their original design. People sometimes forget that the thing they have touched leaves a trace beyond its presence." Briggs gave her a puzzled look but said nothing, sipping his tea as if the warmth might help him keep up. After he left, Miss Marple decided it was time to take her own quiet look about. The village would be busy enough with people in and out of one another's houses to share news. Her visit to the vicarage would cause no undue talk. She found Beatrice Simpkins in the kitchen, sleeves rolled to the elbow, making porridge with the precise movements of someone who found comfort in routine. "I'm sorry for your loss, my dear," Miss Marple said, and meant it. Beatrice nodded, lips tight. Harold had his ways, too soft for some things. But he was my brother. She stirred the pot without looking up. "I'll not have people saying he was careless." "Quite right. Did he keep anything of importance in the lantern room?" "Only the lanterns, and those parish records that won't fit in the vestry cupboard. He kept the church key in his coat pocket, always. Never left it about." She paused. "But last night, he wasn't wearing his usual coat. Took the one with the deeper pocket. Said he'd be fetching something heavy." "Something heavy?" "That's what he told me." Beatrice's brow furrowed. "Said he'd been asked to bring it down for a look. Wouldn't say who'd asked, only that it was on church business and not to fuss." Miss Marple asked if she might see the coat. Beatrice fetched it from the peg by the scullery door. The wool was of decent quality, but worn at the cuffs. Miss Marple's fingers, light as a moth's wings, traced the seams until they found a faint, greasy smear at hip level. She said nothing, only folded the coat neatly and thanked Beatrice. From the vicarage, Miss Marple took the lane toward the schoolhouse. The stile where she had found the wax was dry now, the mark dulled. She crossed into the small yard where Miss Lark was chalking the day's lessons onto a portable board, her movements brisk, but her eyes clouded. Evelyn Sykes sat on the steps, swinging her legs, watching the chalk like a cat watches a dangling string. "Good morning, Miss Lark," Miss Marple said. "Good morning, Miss Marple. It's a dreadful business, isn't it?" "Yes, indeed. One never expects such things so near to home." She let her gaze drift toward Evelyn, who smiled shyly. "You have a fine singing voice, I hear." Evelyn blushed. "The rector said I should sing more." "I dare say he did." Miss Marple turned to Miss Lark. "And where were you when the bell tolled last night?" "With Thomas," Miss Lark said, a touch too quickly. "He was upset. We stayed by the bench until people began to move toward the tower." Miss Marple smiled, as if satisfied, though her mind noted the speed of the answer, the neatness of it. Too neat, perhaps. She left them and walked back toward the green, passing Mr. Penrose's neat little cottage. He was in the front garden, trimming the hedge with his usual precision. "Morning, Miss Marple," he called, his pince-nez flashing. "Terrible goings-on. I've offered to help Briggs organize the witness accounts. Someone must ensure the facts are recorded properly." "I'm sure you'll do it splendidly," she said. "And did you see the rector at any point after he left the fete stalls?" Penrose hesitated only fractionally. "Number I was busy with the accounts table. Mrs. Carter will tell you the same." "I shall be certain to ask her," Miss Marple said, and left him to his hedge. Mrs. Carter, when she found her, was in her conservatory, pruning a potted camellia with unnecessary force. "Jane," she said, her tone a mixture of welcome and urgency. "You can't imagine the strain this has put upon the committee. I told Harold years ago that the lantern room was impractical." Miss Marple regarded the white lace gloves folded neatly on the table. The faint smear she had seen last night was gone, but she noticed a darker stain at the seam of one finger, as if something had been hastily scrubbed. "You were asking after the blue lantern," Miss Marple said conversationally. Mrs. Carter looked surprised. "Yes, only because it's the showpiece." "Why?" "Oh, no reason. I only thought it curious that it was missing when the rector, well, you know." Mrs. Carter set down her pruning shears. "Do you think it was used as a weapon?" Miss Marple smiled. "It is possible. But more interesting, I think, is why it was removed from the room at all. That afternoon, The search for the lantern began in earnest. Briggs, assisted by Horace Fletcher, went through the vestry, the storeroom, and even the belfry. The blue lantern was not found, but in the cupboard beneath the stairs, behind a stack of hymnals, Briggs discovered a folded length of coarse cloth stained with wax, blue wax, and a dent at one corner as though something heavy had been pressed into it. Miss Marple, when told of it, only nodded. "It will be interesting to know who had the key to that cupboard," she said, "and when it was last opened." By evening, the village's restlessness had deepened. At the post office, people whispered about who had been seen near the church at dusk. At the grocer's, the talk was of old grudges and unpaid debts. And in her neat little sitting room, Miss Marple thought about bells. Bells called people to service, to weddings, to funerals. But they could also be used for private messages, understood only by those who knew the code. 3 chimes in slow succession, enough to be solemn, enough to draw the rector's attention without alarming the whole fete. Someone had known exactly what sound would bring him up the tower, without question. She thought, too, of the path from the lantern room to the schoolhouse and the wax on the stile. Someone had gone that way in haste, perhaps to hide the lantern, or what was inside it, before the body was discovered. She had almost decided to pay a quiet visit to the schoolhouse garden after dark, when a knock came at her door. It was Thomas, cap in hand, shifting from foot to foot. "Miss Marple," he said, "I didn't tell the constable everything." She looked at him over her spectacles. "And why not, dear?" "I was scared," he said simply. "When I went up to the lantern room, I thought I heard someone on the stairs below me. Just for a second, like a shoe scuff. But when I looked, there was no one." "And when was that?" "Right before I saw the rector." Miss Marple's mind fitted the piece neatly into place. Someone had waited until the rector was distracted, then slipped down ahead of Thomas, taking the lantern, or its contents, by the shortcut past the stile. It was not yet enough to name the killer, but it confirmed what she had suspected. The murder was not about the fete, or the lanterns, or even the rector himself. It was about something hidden, something worth killing for, and the lantern was only the cover. She thanked Thomas and sent him home, then sat back in her chair. Outside, the mist was thickening again, blurring the lamps along the green. Tomorrow, she thought, she would begin her own form of questioning. Softly, without the constable's bluntness, starting with the one person in the village who knew how to make a disappearance look like a tradition kept. The next morning brought a brittle sunlight that sliced through the mist but did nothing to warm the air. It was the kind of light that revealed every mark on a window pane, every imperfection in a painted door. St. Aldhelm's seemed to shrink from it. People walked briskly, speaking in lowered tones, as though daylight itself might overhear their thoughts. Miss Marple, however, found such light most agreeable for the sort of errands she had in mind. It was a day, she thought, for looking at things plainly. She set off across the green with a basket on her arm, ostensibly bound for the grocer's, but in truth aiming first for the schoolhouse. Miss Lark was outside, supervising Evelyn Sykes, who was sweeping the path with more flourish than effect. The girl's pale hair caught the sunlight, and she looked up from her task with a quick, almost guilty smile when she saw Miss Marple approach. "Good morning," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Such a fine day after all that mist." Miss Lark agreed, though her voice carried an edge of distraction. "I was admiring your hedge," Miss Marple went on, glancing toward the low yew that bordered the yard. "And I wondered, you don't by any chance store any of the choir's lanterns here, do you? I imagine you must have overflow from the church." Miss Lark looked startled. No, we've never kept them here. Why do you ask? Oh, no reason, Miss Marple said, smiling as if she had only been curious. But her eyes rested for a fraction longer on the small wooden shed at the far end of the yard. Its padlock was firmly in place, yet the earth at its base showed fresh disturbance, as though someone had crouched there recently. Evelyn, eager to talk, volunteered, "Miss Lark says we mustn't go in there. It's just for old music stands and chairs." Miss Marple's reply was mild. Quite right to keep such things in order. After a few more pleasantries, she left them and took the path toward the vicarage, her mind quietly sorting what she had seen. A locked shed, freshly disturbed soil, a girl instructed not to enter, and wax, blue wax, found on a stile not 50 yards away. At the vicarage, Beatrice Simpkins met her at the door. She looked tired, her eyes red from a night of little sleep. "I've been expecting you, Miss Marple," she said without preamble. "You're not one to let things lie." "I'm afraid not," Miss Marple said gently. "You told me yesterday that your brother would have gone up to the lantern room, only if called on church business. Did he receive many such summonses from Miss Lark?" "Not many. He thought her a good influence on the children, but he worried about that girl she lodges, Evelyn. Said there was something flighty about her." Beatrice pursed her lips. "And he didn't care for Mrs. Carter's way of handling committee funds, too quick to move things about without recording them." "That is interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "Do you happen to know if any of the lanterns had compartments, false bottoms perhaps, for storing small items?" Beatrice considered. "Some of the older ones, yes. The blue one most of all. It's larger than the others. And my brother once told me it had a hidden space inside for extra candles." "Why?" "Oh, just a passing thought," Miss Marple said, though inwardly she felt a distinct tightening of the threads in her mind. From the vicarage she went on to the post office, where Constable Briggs was leaning against the counter, talking to the postmistress. He straightened when he saw her. "Morning, Miss Marple. We've been through every cupboard in the church and half the sheds in the village. No sign of the blue lantern." "I imagine not," Miss Marple said. "But have you searched Miss Lark's shed?" Briggs frowned. "The schoolhouse? Number Y?" "Because," Miss Marple said mildly, "when one finds blue wax near a path that leads directly to a locked shed, it is sometimes worth having a look inside." Briggs looked at her sharply. "You've seen something?" "I've seen enough to suggest it would be sensible." It took only a quarter of an hour for Briggs to assemble himself, the verger, and the schoolmistress in the yard. Miss Lark looked affronted when he asked for the key, but she handed it over without protest. The shed smelled of dust and old wood. Stacks of music stands leaned in one corner, folding chairs in another. And there, tucked behind a box of hymnals, was the blue lantern. Briggs let out a low whistle. "Well, that's that then." But Miss Marple stepped closer. "Not quite. Let's have a look inside." The lantern was heavier than it should have been. Briggs unlatched the fluted brass crown and tipped it forward. Something slid out and clinked softly on the chair seat beneath. A small, velvet-covered case. Inside, nestled in the worn lining, lay a gold brooch set with a single emerald. Miss Lark gasped. That's Mrs. Carter's. She lost it months ago and accused the committee maid of stealing it." Miss Marple glanced at Briggs. "I expect Mrs. Carter will have an interesting explanation." Briggs pocketed the case. "And how did it end up in your shed, Miss Lark?" "I don't know," Miss Lark said, her face pale. "I swear I've never seen it before." Miss Marple watched her closely. The protest had been immediate, but not accompanied by outrage, more by fear. By the time Briggs returned the lantern to the church for examination, word had already begun to spread. That afternoon, Miss Marple called at Mrs. Carter's conservatory. The lady received her with a mixture of suspicion and brittle charm. "I hear there's been a discovery," Miss Marple began. Mrs. Carter arched an eyebrow. "I suppose you mean my brooch." "Yes, Briggs brought it to me. I told him I'd mislaid it. Thought perhaps it had fallen into some crack at the fete last summer. And yet it was found in a locked shed," Miss Marple said softly. "Inside the very lantern you inquired after so specifically on the night of the murder." Mrs. Carter's lips tightened. "Are you accusing me of something, Jane?" "I'm simply observing," Miss Marple said. "Objects don't walk into sheds on their own. And it seems the rector was called up to the lantern room on a matter involving that lantern. Perhaps he discovered what was hidden in it." Mrs. Carter's color rose. Harold Simpkins was a fussy man who liked to pry. If he'd found my brooch, he might have made some ridiculous scene. But I assure you, I had nothing to do with his death. Miss Marple inclined her head, accepting the denial without comment. But as she walked back across the green, she reflected that Mrs. Carter had said nothing about how the brooch had come to be in the lantern in the first place. That evening, Miss Marple took a slow walk past the schoolhouse again. The shed was still locked, the ground still disturbed. She stood for a moment, considering. The rector's death, the missing lantern, the brooch. These were parts of the same puzzle. But the picture they formed was not yet complete. She thought of Thomas's account, the scuff of a shoe on the stairs, the door on the latch, the missing lantern carried away before he reached the top. Whoever had done it had known the rector's habits, known how to summon him without raising alarm, and known the quickest path to hide what they had taken. Her eyes drifted toward the lane that led behind the vicarage to the back of the schoolhouse. It was a quiet, shaded path, overlooked by few windows. In the fading light, it seemed almost to invite secrecy. The question now was whether the killing had been meant to silence the rector, or to cover the theft of the brooch and whatever else might have been hidden in that lantern's secret compartment. The answer, Miss Marple suspected, would reveal not only the killer, but the true nature of what the rector had stumbled upon in that shadowed little room above the fete. And she meant to find out before another bell tolled in St. Aldhelm's. The following morning broke with a thin frost that rimed the churchyard grass, giving the stones a silver edge. The cold air seemed to sharpen every sound in St. Aldhelm's. The creak of a cart wheel in the lane, the clink of milk bottles on a doorstep, the faint slam of a distant door. For all its brightness, it was the kind of morning when people drew their scarves tighter and spoke only if they must. Miss Marple took her tea at the small table by the window, her mind quietly busy. The blue lantern had been found, the brooch returned to its owner, and yet the business was far from over. The brooch, in itself, was a petty theft. Murder was something else entirely. One might be done on impulse, the other only with planning. And the missing hours, between the tolling of the bell and the discovery of the rector, remained curiously blurred. She set her cup down and glanced at the small notebook in which she occasionally jotted observations. There, among the neat lines, she had underlined 3 things twice: the knot in the bell rope, the wax on the stile, and Thomas's shoe scuff on the stairs. All 3 suggested presence and movement, not the absence or stillness that a guilty party might hope to project. Her morning was interrupted by a visit from Briggs, his breath white in the cold air as he stepped inside. He rubbed his gloved hands. "Miss Marple, I've been thinking over that brooch business." Carter says she lost it months ago, but the maid she accused swears she was innocent. If the rector found it in the lantern, why wouldn't he have just returned it? Perhaps, Miss Marple said mildly, because it was not simply a matter of returning it. The hiding place may have suggested to him some larger arrangement. And you see, Constable, once one begins to wonder who placed it there, one might begin to wonder what else they have placed and where. Briggs frowned. You think there's more than just a trinket? I think there may have been something that mattered more than a trinket. A brooch makes an excellent decoy, particularly when there is already a public story about its disappearance. Briggs's brow furrowed as he followed the thought. And the rector might have stumbled on it without the thief expecting him to? Possibly. Or perhaps, Miss Marple said, he was lured to that room precisely so that his discovery could be managed before others arrived. Briggs gave her a slow nod. We'll need to talk to them again, all of them, and I'd like you there. By mid-morning, Briggs had gathered the key figures in the church vestry, its air faintly scented with old hymnals and the polish of many Saturdays' cleaning. Mrs. Carter sat with her gloved hands folded in her lap, her expression one of cultivated patience. Mr. Penrose adjusted his pince-nez repeatedly, as if the clarity of his lenses might improve the clarity of the situation. Miss Lark sat very straight, her eyes fixed on the table. Evelyn Sykes perched beside her, fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. Horace Fletcher, the verger, stood near the door with the air of a man who would rather be anywhere else. Briggs began plainly. The blue lantern has been found, in the schoolhouse shed. Inside it was Mrs. Carter's brooch, missing for several months. The rector went up to the lantern room on the night of the fete, likely in connection with that lantern. Shortly after, he was struck from behind and killed. I need to know how the lantern came to be in that shed and why. Silence met this. It was Miss Marple who spoke first, her tone gentle. I wonder, Mrs. Carter, if you would tell us again when you last saw your brooch before it was returned to you. Mrs. Carter's eyes narrowed slightly. I told the constable it was at last summer's fete. I remember fastening it before I left the house, and when I returned it was gone. The maid left not long after, under suspicion. And you never saw it again until yesterday? Never. Miss Marple nodded, as if accepting this entirely. Then she turned to Miss Lark. And you have no idea how it came to be in your shed? None at all, Miss Lark said. Her voice was firm, but her hands, clasped in her lap, tightened almost imperceptibly. Evelyn, sensing the eyes on her, blurted, I didn't touch it. I wouldn't dare. Miss Lark keeps the shed locked. Miss Marple's gaze softened toward the girl. And yet, my dear, I suspect you have been in there. Perhaps to fetch something for the choir? Evelyn's eyes darted to Miss Lark, then back to her lap. Once, she admitted, to get extra candles for the carol service. Miss Lark sent me. Blue candles? Yes, the old kind, for the lanterns. They smell funny when they burn. Horace Fletcher stirred at the door. Those candles should be in the church storeroom. They're not for casual use. Briggs pounced. So someone moved them to the shed? The verger shrugged stiffly. Not me. I'd never store parish property outside the church. Miss Marple let the murmurs settle before speaking, again. It is curious, she said, that the rector's hem had a smear of blue wax, and that wax of the same sort was found on the stile leading to the schoolhouse path. One might almost think the lantern had been carried that way, still warm from a candle. Penrose adjusted his pince-nez. And you suggest this was done in haste, after the murder? I suggest it was done in such a way as to prevent the lantern's contents from being seen by the wrong eyes," Miss Marple said. "Perhaps the rector was not meant to see them at all." Mrs. Carter broke in, her tone sharp. "Are we to suppose that one of us killed Harold Simpkins over a trinket?" "Not over the brooch, I think," Miss Marple said. "Over something that the brooch conveniently concealed." Briggs looked from face to face. "Until I know what that was, I can't name the killer. But I do know this. The rector was deliberately summoned by the 3 solemn chimes of the Sanctus bell, and whoever tied the bell rope after using it was not the verger." Horace Fletcher looked indignant. "Of course it wasn't me. That knot was tidy enough, but not my style. Too fussy. I said as much to you, Constable." Miss Marple's eyes moved to Penrose. "And yet Mr. Penrose is known for a certain carefulness in his arrangements. The way he carried that tray at the fete, for example, balanced and precise. One can see how he might tie such a knot." Penrose bristled. "Really, Miss Marple, He stopped, catching himself. Briggs leaned forward. "Where were you when the bell tolled, Mr. Penrose?" "In the tea tent," Penrose said smoothly. "I was reorganizing the raffle tickets." Mrs. Carter made a small noise in her throat, something between a laugh and a scoff. "Not quite. You left the tent for a time, Alfred? I saw you going toward the church." Penrose turned on her sharply. "You must be mistaken." Miss Marple let the exchange pass without pressing it. Instead, she said, "The difficulty with carefully arranged stories is that they rarely fit the small accidents of real life. And in a village, people remember small accidents. One remembers, for example, seeing a figure take the path behind the vicarage just before the crowd gathered at the tower. And one remembers the color of the coat, dark gray with a faint sheen, rather like yours, Mr. Penrose." There was a tight pause. Penrose's jaw worked, but he said nothing. Briggs closed his notebook with a snap. "We'll continue these talks separately. Miss Marple, I think you and I need a word." When the others had gone, Briggs muttered, "You think it's him." "I think he knows more than he wishes to tell," Miss Marple said. "But whether that is guilt or merely self-preservation, I cannot yet say. Remember, Constable, the rector's death may have been intended to prevent him from speaking about something he found. That something may still be in the village, and whoever has it will not feel safe while we are looking." She rose, smoothing her skirt. "I believe I shall pay a call on Mrs. Price. She has nothing to do with any of this, but she has a view of the back lane from her sewing room. And people notice more when they are looking out of habit rather than suspicion." By the time the weak winter sun dipped toward the rooftops, Miss Marple had her answer. Mrs. Price, busy with her mending, had indeed seen a figure slip along the lane on the night of the fete. "Couldn't say who it was," she told Miss Marple, "but they were carrying something big and awkward, all wrapped up. And I heard metal clink when they set it down to climb the stile." That, Miss Marple thought as she walked home, was the piece she needed. Not the identity of the figure, yet, but the fact that the lantern had been wrapped before it left the tower. Whoever killed the rector had come prepared, not only to strike, but to carry away their prize unnoticed. The only question was, what was worth such preparation? And why had it been hidden in a church lantern at all? She felt the answer drawing closer, like the sound of a bell that begins faintly in the distance and grows louder with each step toward the tower. The following day was a Sunday, but the usual rhythm of bells, parishioners, and post-service chatter on the church green was broken entirely. The morning service had been canceled. Reverend Simpkins's absence was too raw, and the vestry still held the smell of polish mingled with something darker. In the absence of the rector's voice, the silence seemed heavier. People walked past the church rather than through its doors, their glances quick and evasive. Miss Marple, however, was not avoiding the place. She arrived at the green just after 9, her hat firmly in place against the sharp wind. She had decided that the time had come for a more deliberate round of visits. Visits which, in her way, would be conversations dressed up as kindness. She knew from long habit that people told more truth when they believed they were talking about something else entirely. Her first call was to Mrs. Carter. The conservatory smelled faintly of camellias and something more pungent, the sharp tang of silver polish. Mrs. Carter greeted her with slightly theatrical cheer. "My dear Jane, I am so glad you've come. You cannot imagine the strain I've been under since all this began." "I think I can imagine it quite well," Miss Marple said mildly, settling herself in a wicker chair. "And I did want to speak to you about the lantern room. You were quite concerned for the blue lantern, weren't you?" Mrs. Carter's smile cooled. "Only because it's the centerpiece. These fêtes are judged by their appearance as much as by the money they raise." "I suppose so. And when you mentioned it to the rector, he went up directly?" "I don't know that I spoke to him about it directly," Mrs. Carter said, a shade too quickly. There were so many people about that evening. Miss Marple gave a small, knowing nod and let the matter drop. Instead, she turned the conversation to the old days of the fête, and Mrs. Carter, pleased to be the source of history, began to recount stories of long-ago disputes over stall placements and prize allocations. But Miss Marple, while appearing to listen with interest, was noting something else. A small nick on the inside edge of Mrs. Carter's manicure, as though a fingernail had caught on metal. And there was that faint scent again. Not camellia, but the waxy tang of old candles. From Mrs. Carter's, she went to Mr. Penrose's tidy little house, where he was already at his desk, papers arranged in rigid stacks. He received her politely, though with an air of preoccupation. "I wonder," Miss Marple said conversationally, "how one organizes records for an event like the fête. You must keep quite an eye on the accounts." Penrose straightened, pleased to have the chance to explain. "It's all quite meticulous, Miss Marple. Receipts, invoices, petty cash, everything in order. Why do you ask?" "I only thought," Miss Marple said, "that such attention to order might be quite useful in other matters. For instance, the knot in the bell rope was most neat. It takes a particular kind of hand to tie something so tidy under pressure." Penrose's pince-nez flashed as he blinked at her. "I've no idea what you mean." "Of course not," Miss Marple said amiably. "Though it must be said, people's habits have a way of revealing themselves in the smallest things." As she left, she caught sight of his overcoat hanging in the hall. Dark gray, faintly sheened, just as Mrs. Price had described. A tiny fleck of something pale clung to the cuff. She didn't touch it, but she noted its color. Blue. Her last call that morning was to the schoolhouse. Miss Lark answered the door, looking weary. Evelyn was in the yard, sweeping again. "Such a diligent girl," Miss Marple said to Miss Lark, with a warm glance toward the young lodger. "And so useful to have her help with choir matters. I wonder, did she ever take a lantern over to the church for you?" Miss Lark hesitated. "Once or twice, perhaps, only for rehearsals." "And on the night of the fete?" "No." The answer was too fast, too flat. Miss Marple said nothing, merely nodding as though satisfied. but she made a note of the way Miss Lark's eyes flicked toward the shed before she spoke. That afternoon, Briggs called at Miss Marple's cottage. "We've looked over that lantern," he said without preamble. "Hidden compartment in the base, just as you said. Big enough for something more than a brooch. Trouble is, it's empty now." "As I expected," Miss Marple said. "You see, Constable, the brooch was left there to give a harmless explanation for why the lantern was moved. But the real object was removed before the body was discovered." Briggs sat forward. "You think the rector saw it?" "I think he saw enough to know there was something there. And I think he was struck before he could tell anyone what it was." Briggs rubbed his chin. But what could be so valuable? Hidden in a church lantern? "Not necessarily valuable in money," Miss Marple said. "Valuable in danger. Letters, perhaps, or a document that would ruin someone here if it were made public. Churches are full of safe places that are never questioned. Cupboards, hymnals, lanterns used only once or twice a year." Briggs looked troubled. "So whoever killed him isn't just a thief, they're protecting themselves." "Or someone else," Miss Marple said softly. "In my experience, people are often more dangerous when they're shielding another's reputation than when they're guarding their own." That evening, Miss Marple decided to take the long way home from the post office, looping behind the vicarage and past the stile where she'd found the first smear of blue wax. The frost had thawed, leaving the earth soft enough to hold the print of a shoe. Just beyond the stile, in the narrow strip of hedge that bordered the schoolhouse garden, she saw a thin glint of metal half buried in the soil. She bent carefully and drew it out. The latch from a lantern's crown, its hinge slightly bent. It still smelled faintly of paraffin. She held it in her palm a moment, thinking. If the lantern had been opened in haste, something taken out, this latch could have been dropped along the way, an accident in the kind of nervous rush that follows violence. And it had landed here, on the very path Mrs. Price had seen the figure take. The next morning, she walked straight to Briggs's office and set the latch on his desk. "Proof," she said, "that the lantern was opened before it reached the shed. Whatever was inside was carried separately from that point." Briggs stared at the latch. But who could have known it was there in the first place? Miss Marple's eyes were calm. Someone who had hidden it there themselves, or someone they had confided in. The rector was neither of those people, which means the killer is among those who knew the blue lantern's secret before that night. And that number, Constable, is very small. Briggs exhaled. "You're saying it's one of the committee?" "I am saying," Miss Marple replied, "that before this is over, we shall find that the murder was committed not for greed, but for the preservation of a story no one was meant to hear. And the only question left is which of our little group found their conscience outweighed by their fear." As she left his office, the winter sun was thin over the rooftops, throwing long shadows across the lane. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves and walked steadily toward the green. Somewhere behind one of those neat doors, the person she sought was watching events close in, their composure beginning to fray. She had seen it before. The small betrayals in a voice, the glance that arrives a beat too late. And soon, she thought, one more careful knot would come undone. "You said, Section 7, 1,200 words," ChatGPT said. The Monday after the fete arrived gray and damp, with a drizzle that seemed determined to flatten every sprig of holly and sag the bunting still strung along the green. Most villagers had taken it down already, not out of respect for Reverend Simpkins, though that was the polite explanation, but because no one cared to have a reminder of the night's events fluttering outside their windows. Miss Marple left her cottage with her umbrella and an unhurried step. She had slept well, which usually meant her mind had been working steadily during the night. The fragments were beginning to arrange themselves. The 3 solemn chimes, the missing blue lantern, the brooch as a decoy, the schoolhouse shed, and now the bent latch dropped along the back path. These were not the random happenings of a village fete gone wrong. They were the deliberate acts of someone who had prepared well, and yet had not foreseen every consequence. Her first call that morning was to the vicarage. Beatrice Simpkins answered the door, her face thinner than the week before, but her manner brisk. "I've been thinking," Miss Marple began, once they were in the kitchen, "about what you said, that your brother would only have gone to the lantern room for certain people, and that Miss Lark was one of them." Beatrice stirred her tea. Yes, he worried over that girl of hers, thought Evelyn was too trusting. Did he ever speak of anything he'd found? Something that troubled him, but that he didn't feel ready to tell you? Beatrice hesitated, then said, 2 weeks ago, he mentioned that one of the committee was behaving oddly with church property. He wouldn't say who, but he'd started keeping an eye on the lantern room. Said it was the perfect place for someone to hide something, because no one ever looked there except at fete time. Miss Marple's eyes warmed with understanding. And on the night of the fete, the bell was rung to call him there. 3 chimes that told him it was urgent. Beatrice nodded. And he went, of course. He would have gone for anyone, but especially for someone who claimed it was on church business. Miss Marple left her soon after and made her way toward the schoolhouse. Miss Lark was outside again, but this time she had no tasks for Evelyn, who lingered at the doorway with a slightly restless air. "I was hoping to borrow a hymn book," Miss Marple said, smiling. "For comparison. I've always liked to see how the arrangements differ." Miss Lark fetched one from the shelf in the front room, and while she did, Miss Marple addressed Evelyn. "You must enjoy singing with the lanterns lit in the church." Evelyn nodded. "It makes it feel like a story. The blue one is the nicest. And on the night of the fete?" Miss Marple asked casually. "Was it already in the lantern room when you last saw it?" Evelyn's brow furrowed. "I don't think so. I saw it in the vestry in the afternoon, on the table with the hymnals. But Mr. Penrose said it should be in the lantern room, so he picked it up and carried it away. He told me to tell Miss Lark that he'd taken it." Miss Marple felt the faintest tightening in her chest. She thanked the girl warmly, took the hymn book, and stepped back into the damp street. She did not go home directly. Instead, she stopped at Briggs's office. He was bent over a list of names and looked up with relief when she entered. "You've something?" he said, seeing her expression. "I have," Miss Marple said. Evelyn saw Mr. Penrose carrying the blue lantern well before the bell was rung, which means the lantern, and whatever was hidden inside, was already in his possession. He had only to lure the rector up to the lantern room and ensure that no one else arrived before him. Briggs sat back. That would explain why the knot wasn't the verger's, and why the path Mrs. Price described matches his coat. But what was in the lantern? "That," Miss Marple said, "is the heart of the matter. And I think we shall not find it in the church or in the schoolhouse shed. We must consider what sort of thing one might hide in a lantern that would be too dangerous to leave in plain sight." Briggs's brow furrowed. "You think it's not stolen property?" "Not in the usual sense. I think it may be papers. Letters, perhaps. or a document that could cause a scandal. The lantern's hidden compartment would be a perfect temporary hiding place for something that must be moved without drawing notice. And if the rector saw them, she let the sentence fade. Briggs swore softly under his breath. So Penrose moves the lantern, rings the bell, gets the rector up there alone, and then, Miss Marple finished gently, removes the contents, wraps the lantern, and takes it by the back path to the schoolhouse, dropping the latch along the way. The brooch, already inside, was left there to provide a harmless reason for the lantern's removal, should anyone find it. Briggs nodded slowly. It fits, but I'll need more than fits before I can act. Then we must invite Mr. Penrose to show us exactly how one ties such a knot in a bell rope, Miss Marple said, her eyes bright. Under the guise of helping us understand the sequence of events, of course. People give themselves away when they repeat a thing they've done before. They have a rhythm to it. The arrangement was made by late afternoon. In the chilly quiet of the church, with its scent of damp stone, Penrose was amiable enough, even faintly proud, when Briggs suggested he might demonstrate the knotting for clarity's sake. He tied it neatly, with the same deliberate movements Miss Marple remembered seeing when he carried the tray of scones. Exactly so, Miss Marple said when he stepped back. One can see how well practiced you are in precise work. Penrose smiled thinly. A matter of habit. And habits, Miss Marple said, are the most reliable witnesses of all. Briggs dismissed him with thanks, but once Penrose had gone, he muttered, "It's him. That knot's identical, but I still don't have the papers or whatever it was he took." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Which means he still has them, or has placed them somewhere he feels safe. If he kept them, they will weigh on him. If he's passed them to another, that person will now share his anxiety." That night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting untouched in her lap. She thought of Penrose's self-control, his meticulous habits, his tidy lies. Such people, she knew, often stumbled not over what they had hidden, but over whom they had trusted in the process. And somewhere in St. Aldhelm's, she was certain that trust was about to fray. The person who had received the lantern's true contents might already be feeling the strain, the fear that they too could be drawn into the open. And when that fear grew sharp enough, it would drive them to act. Rashly, perhaps, but in a way that would reveal the truth. When Miss Marple banked her fire and prepared for bed, she thought of the sound of bells again, the summoning tone, so heavy with tradition that no one questioned it. Whoever had rung them that night had relied on that trust. But trust, she knew, was like a thread. Once nicked, it could unravel very quickly indeed. By Tuesday morning, the drizzle had given way to a pale, wintry sun, thin as paper and no warmer. It caught on the frost in the churchyard grass, making the stones gleam like iced cakes. For most of St. Aldhelm's, the day began with the usual errands. Post collected, bread fetched from the bakery. But the air still felt taut, as though the village were holding its breath. Those who had been in the lantern room since the fete looked at one another in the street with the faint, strained smiles of people bound by an uncomfortable secret. Miss Marple walked to the green with her basket, but she had no intention of buying anything. She had made up her mind the night before that it was time to prod the web, just enough to see which strands quivered. In her long experience, the guilty rarely revealed themselves through confession. Rather, they did so when trying to secure the cooperation or silence of someone else. And she suspected that whoever had received the lantern room's true contents might now be feeling the need for reassurance from their accomplice. Her opportunity came sooner than expected. She was passing the narrow lane behind the post office when she saw Mrs. Carter, her white gloves immaculate this morning, speaking in a low voice to Penrose. They stood close together, Mrs. Carter leaning in, Penrose stiff but attentive. When Mrs. Carter glanced around and saw Miss Marple, her voice rose into the false brightness of someone making a remark about the weather. "Good morning, Jane. Isn't it fine to see the sun at last?" Miss Marple returned the greeting, as if she had noticed nothing unusual, and continued on her way. But she had seen the quick movement of Penrose's hand, passing something small and flat into Mrs. Carter's palm. Not the bulk of documents, but perhaps a note, too quickly concealed for Briggs to find in any search. Later that morning, Miss Marple paid a call on Beatrice Simpkins. The vicarage kitchen smelled of tea and toast, and Beatrice was darning a pair of socks with steady, unhurried stitches. "Did your brother ever keep personal papers somewhere outside the vicarage?" Miss Marple asked, after a little conversation about the weather and the post. "Only at the church," Beatrice said. "He had a drawer in the vestry, but it was never locked. He said it wasn't worth the trouble." Miss Marple nodded. "And if something important had been hidden there, something damaging, he would have moved it, I expect." Beatrice paused in her stitching. "Yes, Harold had a strong sense of duty. If he found something he thought could harm the parish or the people in it, he would have put it somewhere safe until he could decide how to act. Somewhere no one would think to look." "Like the base of a lantern," Miss Marple said gently. Beatrice's eyes narrowed. "Are you telling me he was killed over papers?" "I think it's possible," Miss Marple said. "And I think the person who hid them has been very anxious since that night." From the vicarage she went to Briggs. He was in his small office with the stove rattling against the cold, reading over his notes. Miss Marple described what she had seen between Penrose and Mrs. Carter. "She's been nervous since we found her brooch," Briggs said. "If Penrose passed her something this morning, I'd wager it's connected to those papers." "I think so too," Miss Marple said. "We must let them believe they are still unsuspected, long enough for one to lean too heavily on the other. If they've shared whatever was in the lantern, the weaker of the two will break first." Briggs rubbed his chin. "And which is weaker?" Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "In a direct contest, I'd say Mrs. Carter. But fear changes the balance in strange ways. We must be patient." Patience, however, was rewarded sooner than she expected. That afternoon, while Miss Marple was making her way to the grocer's, Evelyn Sykes darted out of the schoolhouse yard and ran after her. "Miss Marple, please, don't tell Miss Lark I came to you," the girl said breathlessly. "But I saw something last night." Miss Marple guided her to a quiet bench near the green. "Tell me slowly, dear. What was it?" Evelyn's hands twisted in her lap. "I couldn't sleep, so I was looking out my window. I saw Mr. Penrose come out of Mrs. Carter's conservatory. He was carrying a brown envelope, the big kind. He tucked it under his coat. He looked round and walked off toward the vicarage lane." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And did he go into the vicarage?" He went behind it, toward the path by the yew trees." Evelyn bit her lip. "I don't know what he did after that." Miss Marple thanked her warmly and promised to keep her confidence. As she walked on, her thoughts turned over this new piece. If Penrose had been carrying papers from Mrs. Carter's conservatory, then perhaps the brooch had not been the only item hidden in the lantern after all. Perhaps Mrs. Carter had removed the real contents and kept them at her house until fear or Penrose's insistence persuaded her to pass them back. That evening, Miss Marple went out again. this time taking the back path herself. It was quiet under the yews, the air still with that muffled quality hedged lanes sometimes have in winter. Halfway along, she stopped and bent to look more closely at the earth. There was the faint impression of a shoe, narrow-soled, with a slight ridge along the edge, and beside it, a small scrap of brown paper caught in the hedge. She teased it free. One corner bore the remnants of a printed heading, but the ink had blurred in the damp. She took it straight to Briggs. "Proof that something in an envelope passed this way," she said. Briggs studied it. "If we find the rest of it, we'll know what those papers were. But for now, this only tells us they're still in the village, and in the possession of someone who cannot quite decide where they are safest," Miss Marple said, "which means they will move again." The next day, Briggs arranged for the committee to be invited to the vestry under the pretext of reviewing next month's accounts. Miss Marple attended as if she had merely dropped by. She watched the small, unconscious cues. Mrs. Carter glancing often at Penrose, Penrose avoiding her gaze. Miss Lark stiff and alert, as though she expected to be called upon. In the middle of Briggs's slow recitation of figures, a sound came from the church door. 3 quick knocks. Horace Fletcher went to answer, returning with a boy from the post office carrying a small parcel. "For Mr. Penrose," the boy said, handing it over. Penrose took it with a face carefully composed to mild surprise. "I wasn't expecting anything," he said, but he tucked it quickly into his case without opening it. Miss Marple caught Briggs's eye. That small movement, the hasty concealment, was worth more than any protest of innocence. Whatever was in the parcel was not meant for public view. When the meeting broke up, Penrose left at once, walking briskly toward his house. Miss Marple and Briggs followed at a distance. They saw him unlock his door, step inside, and then, a minute later, slip out the back with the parcel under his arm. He took the lane toward the schoolhouse. "He's moving it again," Briggs muttered. Miss Marple's voice was calm. "Yes, and we shall see to it that this time he cannot finish the journey unseen." She quickened her pace just enough to keep him in sight. Penrose reached the shed in the schoolhouse yard and unlocked it. He glanced around, once to the house, once toward the lane, and then stepped inside. Briggs moved quickly, blocking the doorway. "You'll want to hand that over, Mr. Penrose." For a moment, Penrose's face held the blankness of a man weighing his chances of bluffing. Then he sighed and set the parcel on the nearest chair. Briggs opened it. Inside was a sheaf of folded papers, their edges worn and smudged. Miss Marple, looking over his shoulder, saw enough to know their nature. Letters, written in the rector's hand, addressed to a name she did not recognize, but concerning financial irregularities in the church accounts, irregularities that implicated Mrs. Carter. Penrose spoke first. "I didn't kill him. I only wanted to keep these from being misused." Miss Marple's tone was gentle but firm. "And yet, by taking them, you made yourself part of the deception. And when the rector saw the lantern and guessed what was inside, you were already in place to ensure he did not speak." Penrose looked at her sharply. "You think I think," Miss Marple said, "that you tied that knot in the bell rope, rang the bell, and removed the papers. But whether you also struck the blow, that, Mr. Penrose, I am not yet prepared to say." Briggs gathered the papers, his jaw set. "We'll keep these safe now, and I think I'll have another talk with Mrs. Carter, without her gloves this time." As they walked back across the green, Miss Marple felt the shape of the truth pressing closer. The papers had been the heart of the matter all along. The brooch had been only a pretty distraction. But the blow that killed the rector, that still had a shadow over it. And somewhere in that shadow, she was certain, another hand had moved. One that might not yet realize how close it was to being seen. The day after the papers were recovered dawned cold and very clear. The kind of morning when sound travels unnaturally far, and the frost lies like sugar across the rooftops. The bells in the church remained silent still, though their dark silhouettes in the tower seemed almost to brood over the green. People went about their errands with that strained politeness peculiar to villages in the midst of scandal. Quick nods, eyes sliding away, voices lowered. Miss Marple had woken early, her mind sharpening like frost on glass. The discovery of the letters had narrowed the field considerably. She did not yet know who had struck the fatal blow, but she knew two important things. First, that the motive lay in keeping those letters from the rector's hands. And second, that the killer had been in the lantern room with him for at least a few moments before Thomas appeared. She breakfasted early and went to see Briggs. He was in his office with the papers spread out on the desk, each weighted at the corners to keep them flat. "They're genuine," he said without looking up. Markham confirmed the rector's handwriting. They detail certain irregularities with the church roof fund, money transferred without proper approval, and Mrs. Carter's signature appears more than once. Penrose claims he only meant to protect her from scandal. I think that's rot, but so far I can't prove he was the one who killed the rector. Miss Marple glanced over the pages, noting the dates. "The earliest of these is 6 months ago," she said. "Long enough for someone to have been worrying about them. Long enough for them to have been moved more than once. And you see, Constable, whoever killed the rector had to be confident enough to get him alone in the lantern room without arousing suspicion." Briggs leaned back in his chair. "You think that means it wasn't Penrose?" "I think," she said carefully, "that Penrose is capable of deceit and of moving those papers. But the actual killing may have been done by someone who feared what he might do with them if they were found. Someone whose fear outweighed their hesitation." From Briggs's office, she walked toward the vicarage. Beatrice Simpkins received her with a look of grim composure. "Have you heard?" Miss Marple asked. "That the letters have been found?" Beatrice's hands stilled on the teacup she was setting down. "Yes, Briggs told me." "And do you believe Penrose killed your brother?" Beatrice's mouth tightened. "I believe Penrose is a schemer. But I also know Harold would never have turned his back on anyone who came to him asking for help. If someone else was in that room first, someone he trusted, they might have struck before Penrose arrived." Miss Marple studied her. Who would he have trusted most in that moment? Beatrice hesitated. "Mrs. Carter. She's been part of the church for decades. Or Miss Lark, though Harold sometimes thought her too quick to defend that girl of hers." Miss Marple thanked her and left. But she did not go far. Instead, she took the long way to the schoolhouse, noting the way the frost had preserved footprints in the shaded parts of the path. 2 sets of tracks, side by side, went from the lane toward the schoolhouse shed, one narrower, lighter, and set close together, the other broader and longer striding. She crouched to look at them. The smaller prints could easily be Evelyn's, but the larger, they were not Penrose's neat, narrow shoes. Miss Lark opened the door before she could knock. "Oh, Miss Marple, I thought you might be Briggs. Why would Briggs be visiting you this morning?" Miss Lark looked uncomfortable. "He asked me yesterday about the night of the fête. I told him I stayed with Thomas. but I remembered something after he left. Evelyn went to fetch a scarf from the vestry before the music started. She was gone longer than I expected. But when I asked, she said she'd stopped to talk to Mrs. Carter. Miss Marple smiled slightly. That's very interesting. And did Evelyn seem upset afterwards? Miss Lark nodded, frightened in a way, but she wouldn't tell me why. Miss Marple left her with a warm word and went straight to Briggs. We must speak to Evelyn, she said, and we must do it with care. If she saw something in the lantern room before the body was found, she may not even realize its importance. Evelyn was brought to the vestry later that afternoon. She sat on the edge of the wooden chair, looking from Briggs to Miss Marple with wide, uncertain eyes. My dear, Miss Marple said gently, on the night of the fete, you went into the vestry for a scarf, and you met Mrs. Carter there, didn't you? Evelyn's fingers twisted in her lap. Yes. She was holding the blue lantern. She told me she needed to take it up to Mr. Simpkins in the lantern room. She said I could come with her, but then she changed her mind and told me to go back outside. And did you? I went back to the green, but I stopped at the bottom of the tower stairs because I heard voices. I couldn't hear the words, but one of them was Mr. Simpkins. The other was Mrs. Carter's. Evelyn hesitated. Then I heard a loud clink, like metal on wood. And after that, nothing. Briggs leaned forward. And when you looked again? I didn't. I ran back to Miss Lark. But a few minutes later, the bell rang 3 times. Miss Marple's voice was soft. You've done very well to tell us that. And you see, Constable, what it means. Mrs. Carter was in the lantern room with the rector before the bell was rung, which means the call to the rector was a fiction. The bell was rung afterwards, to make it appear he had gone up there alone. Briggs swore quietly. And Penrose? How does he fit? Miss Marple folded her hands. He may have come upon the scene after the blow was struck, found the lantern with the papers still inside, and taken them. That would explain why the knot was his, not Mrs. Carter's. But the person who struck the rector was the one Evelyn heard, Mrs. Carter. The next morning, Briggs went to Mrs. Carter's conservatory with a warrant. She received him with icy politeness. But when confronted with Evelyn's statement, her composure cracked. Yes, I went up to the lantern room, she said sharply. I meant to take the papers from the lantern myself. I'd hidden them there weeks ago, and Harold had no business prying into them. But when I got there, he'd already opened the compartment. We argued. He said he'd take them straight to the bishop. I lost my temper. She looked away, her voice lower. I didn't mean to kill him. I had the lantern in my hands, and I swung it. He fell. There was blood. I panicked. I left the brooch inside so it would look like I'd only been concerned about that, and then I ran. I met Penrose at the bottom of the stairs and told him if he wanted to save the church from scandal, he'd better take the papers away before anyone else found them. Briggs wrote it all down, his face grim. And you let him take the blame, if it came to it. Mrs. Carter's mouth tightened. He agreed, for his own reasons. When Briggs left with her in custody, Miss Marple stood in the cold air of the green, watching the frost melt from the grass. The village would talk for weeks, of course, and the committee would scramble to fill the vacancy in both position and respectability. But the real story would fade soon enough, leaving behind only the small, telling changes. The way certain people avoided certain paths, the way the bells sounded just a little different when rung by a new hand. Miss Marple turned toward her own cottage, her thoughts calm now. In villages, she reflected, The truth was rarely hidden by cleverness alone. It was hidden by the weight of habit, the comfort of believing the same old faces could be trusted. And that was why, when a bell rang in the night, no one thought to ask who had rung it, until it was far too late. The arrest of Mrs. Carter cast a long, uneven shadow over St. Aldhelms. For days after, the village moved in a sort of wary quiet, the kind that falls after a gale when people step outside to find the world changed, yet still recognizably itself. The green was bare now, the fate bunting packed away, the gramophone silent. The lantern room above the church remained locked, its diamond-paned windows catching the winter light without reflection, as though the glass itself disapproved of what had taken place there. Miss Marple's cottage became, for a time, a place of polite curiosity. Neighbors called under the guise of bringing scones or inquiring after her health, but their real purpose was to hear, from the person who had been nearest to the truth all along, how it had been discovered. Miss Marple, with her usual gentle tact, offered only the broadest strokes: Evelyn's courage in speaking up, the recovery of the papers, the constable's persistence. She left out the smallest, most damning details. Some things, she knew, were better left unsaid. Human nature could be observed without always being explained. One such afternoon, Beatrice Simpkins came to call, her mourning black severe against the pale winter light. She sat with her teacup cradled in both hands, the steam curling up into her face. "I keep thinking of that evening," Beatrice said quietly. Harold would have gone anywhere for a parishioner in need. And to think it was that trust. She broke off, pressing her lips together. "I am grateful, Miss Marple, that you saw through it all. I don't suppose I should be surprised." "It is a sad thing," Miss Marple said, softly. "How often harm comes by way of the virtues we most admire. Trust, loyalty, even a certain pride in one's place. They can be turned if someone wishes it enough." Beatrice nodded. "And the roof fund?" "Briggs will see to the accounts," Miss Marple replied. "The bishop will appoint a temporary overseer until proper elections are held. The scandal will pass, though the memory will linger for some." As if on cue, the church bell rang then. Just once. A slow, deliberate toll to mark the hour. Beatrice's eyes flickered upward, but Miss Marple watched her closely and saw, in that moment, no fear. Only the deep-set weariness of one who has seen her certainties altered. Later that week, Briggs himself came to the cottage, hat in hand. He looked more at ease now, though the lines at the corners of his eyes suggested he had been living on less sleep than he ought. "She's confessed in full," he said without preamble. "Said she'd hidden the letters to stop Simpkins from bringing her under church censure. But when she saw he meant to go to the bishop, she acted without thinking. Penrose swears he didn't see the blow, came in just after, and that all he did was tie up the rope and take the papers. I'm inclined to believe him, though I've told him that interfering with evidence could have landed him in the dock alongside her." Miss Marple nodded. People will often risk a great deal to preserve their own view of themselves and of others. He likely told himself he was saving her from worse. Briggs gave a faint smile. "You've a way of seeing it all without looking like you're seeing anything at all. Truth is, without you, I might still be chasing the wrong one." "It's kind of you to say so," Miss Marple replied. "But you would have come to it, Constable. Sooner or later, the truth makes itself felt. My part is only to notice when it knocks a little earlier." In the weeks that followed, the routines of St. Aldhelms began to settle again. The school children walked more briskly past the tower now, casting glances upward as if half expecting to see a flicker of light in the lantern room. Mrs. Price, from her sewing room, took to remarking that the yew path behind the vicarage seemed less traveled these days. Even Mr. Penrose resumed his duties, albeit with a quieter manner, as though the shine had been rubbed from his careful certainties. Evelyn Sykes, emboldened by her role in speaking the truth, sang in the next Sunday service with a clarity that surprised even Miss Lark. Her voice rose under the arching roof with the kind of unself-conscious strength that comes from having been heard once and trusted. Miss Marple attended that service, slipping into her usual pew midway down the aisle. She listened to the music, the rustle of hymn books, the murmur of prayers, and thought how very little most of the congregation knew about the real cause of their rector's absence. It was better that way. Villages, she had long found, healed best when allowed to carry a little mystery with them, enough to keep them watchful, but not so much as to make them suspicious of everyone at once. After the service, as she was leaving, Horace Fletcher caught up with her. "Miss Marple," he said, lowering his voice, "I've put a new lock on the lantern room, stronger than the last. Thought you'd like to know. Very sensible, Mr. Fletcher," she said with a smile. "Though I dare say the trouble won't come from there again for some time." In her garden that afternoon, she pruned the last of the autumn roses, her thoughts turning over the events once more. The image returned to her. The 3 slow chimes, the flicker of light in the lantern room window, the faint smear of wax on the stile. Each had been small in itself, almost trivial, but together they had pointed in a direction that could not be ignored. It was never the great dramatic moments that revealed the truth, she reflected. It was the overlooked things, the way a knot was tied, the readiness of a gloved hand to touch where it should not, the presence of wax where no candle had burned. These, in the end, were more eloquent than any confession. As the weeks slipped by, the story of the lantern room murder became one more thread in the tapestry of St. Aldhelm's history, to be embroidered and embellished in the telling. For some, Mrs. Carter would remain the villain of the piece. For others, she would be a cautionary figure, undone by fear. A very few would remember the part played by Evelyn, or the quiet watchfulness of an elderly lady with a knack for seeing through to the heart of things. One crisp afternoon in early spring, Beatrice Simpkins came to take tea again. The air in the village had lightened. The scandal had settled into memory, its edges dulled by the turning of the season. "I sometimes think," Beatrice said, "that Harold might have been glad, in a way, to know it was all brought into the open. He hated deceit. Perhaps it's better this way, even if—" She trailed off and gave a small, resolute nod. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Truth is rarely comfortable, but it is always cleaner than a lie left to fester. And it is the nature of secrets, my dear, to come to light, whether by lantern or by sun." They sat for a time in companionable silence, the only sound the ticking of the clock and the faint rustle of wind in the garden beyond. When Beatrice rose to go, Miss Marple walked with her to the gate, watching as she made her way down the lane. From somewhere far off, the church bell tolled the hour, slow, steady, and unremarkable. But to Miss Marple's ear, it carried a note of release, as though the tower itself had breathed out the tension it had held since that summer night. She closed the gate and went back inside, her thoughts already turning to the small domestic tasks that awaited her. Life in St. Aldhelm's would go on, as it always did, neatly stitched together by habit, gossip, and the occasional scandal, each leaving its mark in the quiet patterns of village life. And somewhere, perhaps in the lantern room itself, dust was already settling over the place where human fear and frailty had played their part. Miss Marple did not need to look to know it was so. She had learned long ago that the dust always returns, and with it, the semblance of peace. But she also knew that under that quiet surface, human nature would go on being exactly what it had always been: complicated, contradictory, and sooner or later, fatally revealing. Spring had begun to unfurl itself over St. Aldhelm's, timidly at first, snowdrops and crocuses shyly lifting their heads in the churchyard, hedges showing the first green haze, and the lanes smelling faintly of wet earth rather than frost. The harsh edge of winter had softened, but the memory of the lantern room still lingered like a shadow caught in the rafters. By now, Mrs. Carter was gone from the village, awaiting trial in the county town. The matter of the church roof fund had been taken over by a new committee, hastily assembled from those considered both respectable and safe. Mr. Penrose remained on it, though noticeably subdued. The pinched satisfaction that had once been his trademark was replaced by a guarded politeness, as though he knew too well how close he had come to ruin. Miss Marple went about her days as she always had, quietly tending her garden, visiting friends, and walking the village lanes. She knew from experience that the most telling moments after such an affair came not in the days immediately following, when people were full of shock and declarations, but in the weeks later, when the surface had smoothed and what remained was habit, altered in tiny ways. It was on such a walk that she encountered Miss Lark and Evelyn Sykes in the schoolhouse garden. The younger girl was raking leaves, her fair hair catching the sun, while Miss Lark supervised with an expression of thoughtful pride. "She's been singing beautifully in the choir," Miss Marple remarked, pausing at the gate. Miss Lark smiled faintly. "Yes, she has. I think," having spoken the truth gave her a kind of courage. She doesn't flinch as she used to. Evelyn looked up, cheeks pink from the work. "Miss Marple, they say the lantern room will be opened again for the summer fete. Do you think it's safe?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled just a little. "My dear, safety depends far less on the room than on the people who have the key to it. But I dare say precautions will be taken this year, and perhaps it will do the village good to reclaim it from unhappy memory." She left them to their work, noting as she walked away the easy manner between them. One born, she suspected, from a shared sense of having weathered something together. That evening, she had a caller, Horace Fletcher, the verger, who had been reluctant to speak at length during the investigation. He arrived at her door with his cap in his hands, looking awkward. "I thought you ought to know, Miss Marple," he began. "I've been going through the vestry stores. There's something peculiar." He set on her table a small, battered ledger, the kind used for keeping parish inventories. "I found it behind a stack of old hymnals," he said. "Not the church's usual book. This one's older. And in the back there are pages missing. Torn out." Miss Marple turned it over in her hands. The remaining pages were filled in a neat, dated script, lists of items, their condition, and where they were kept. But the missing section began exactly 6 months ago, just when the first of the letters in the lantern had been dated. "Do you know who kept this?" she asked. "Old Reverend Weatherby started it years back," Fletcher said. "Simpkins carried it on for a time. But I think Mrs. Carter took it over when she became head of the fete committee, said it was easier if she knew where all the special items were stored." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but she felt the small confirmation settle in her mind. "I expect those missing pages recorded certain movements, perhaps of the lantern itself, pages she removed when they no longer suited her purpose." Fletcher looked troubled. "Do you think it matters now?" She's gone to trial. It matters, Miss Marple said gently, because it reminds us that the murder did not spring from a single moment of temper, as some might prefer to think, but from a chain of small decisions made over time. Each one drew her closer to the edge. After Fletcher left, she set the ledger aside. She had no wish to feed the village's appetite for new scandal, but she would see that Briggs knew of it. The record belonged in the hands of someone who could weigh it carefully. In the days that followed, she found herself noticing the subtle realignments in the village. Beatrice Simpkins, though still reserved, had begun to take more active part in parish matters, perhaps in quiet honor of her brother's memory. Miss Lark, her dignity intact, carried herself with a little more assurance. Even Mrs. Price seemed to have found a certain satisfaction in recounting her view of the mysterious figure in the lane to anyone who would listen, embellishing the details with each telling. One morning, Briggs stopped by, the ledger in hand. "You were right," he said. The missing pages would have shown that Mrs. Carter moved the blue lantern from the vestry to her own house last autumn, long before the fete. That proves she'd had it in her possession for weeks at a time. Miss Marple nodded. And in that time, she could have placed anything she liked inside it, safe in the knowledge that no one would think to look. Briggs sighed. "I sometimes wonder, Miss Marple, how many crimes start as nothing more than someone convincing themselves they're only borrowing something." "A great many," she said, smiling faintly. "People rarely begin at the worst they can do. They arrive there by comfortable stages." By the end of March, the first preparations for the summer fete had begun, tentative and cautious. The committee met in the village hall instead of the lantern room, and though talk was lively, there was a certain restraint in it, as though everyone feared treading on a subject too close for comfort. Miss Marple attended one such meeting as an observer, knitting quietly in the corner while others discussed stalls and entertainment. At one point, Mr. Penrose caught her eye and inclined his head, an acknowledgment that carried with it, she thought, a measure of gratitude, however indirect. When the meeting ended, she stepped outside into the fading light. The church tower stood against a sky streaked with the pale colors of early evening. For a moment, she thought she saw a faint reflection in the lantern room's glass, as though a light were burning there. But when she looked again, it was only the sun catching on the pane. At home, she made herself a pot of tea and sat by the window as the day slid toward dusk. Outside, the first bats flitted against the deepening blue, and the village lights began to prick on one by one. She thought of how quickly people could grow used to anything, even the knowledge that murder had been done among them, so long as the surface of life remained smooth. That was why, she reflected, it was important to notice the ripples, not to chase them with needless suspicion, but to recognize when the pattern had changed, however slightly. When she finally rose to draw the curtains, she caught the faint chime of the church bell, rung by the new verger. The sound was steady, unremarkable. Yet it held for her the memory of that night, when 3 slow strokes had carried a very different message. Miss Marple stood for a moment in the quiet room, letting the sound fade. The village would continue, as it always had, shaped by its traditions and the small, complicated dramas of those who lived within it. And she, in her own unobtrusive way, would continue to watch. Not out of mistrust, but because she knew too well how quickly trust could be turned to someone's purpose. With that thought, she closed the curtains and went to tend her fire, the soft glow spilling out into the cozy room. Somewhere beyond the window, the church tower kept its silent watch over St. Aldhelm's. And above it, the lantern room, empty now, waited for the next summer evening when its colored panes would glow once more, innocent to the eye and hiding nothing at all. Or so, at least, most people would believe. April arrived in St. Aldhelm's with a gentler warmth than anyone expected, coaxing the hedges into fresh leaf and sending the scent of turned soil drifting from gardens and allotments. The village, having weathered its winter scandal, seemed determined to look forward. Even the lantern room, locked and silent all these months, began to lose its haunted reputation. Children dared each other to run around the base of the tower, and the more practical parishioners spoke briskly of repairs and repainting, as though restoring its outward shine would erase the memory of what had happened inside. Miss Marple, for her part, saw no harm in letting the village's mood lift. She had always believed that communities healed best when they could fold unpleasantness into the broader pattern of their shared life, acknowledging it without letting it dominate. But she also knew that people's natures didn't change simply because the season had turned. The same human frailties that had led to the rector's death would remain, quietly shaping lives in ways that might never make the news. One sunny morning, Beatrice Simpkins invited her to the vicarage garden for tea. The daffodils were in full bloom, their yellow heads nodding gently in the breeze. Beatrice had begun to wear softer colors, and there was a less rigid set to her shoulders. "It feels different now," Beatrice said, handing her a cup. "As if Harold's name has settled into the sort of memory people are comfortable speaking of again. I hear his kindness mentioned more than his untimely end." Miss Marple smiled. "That is as it should be. Time has a way of softening the sharper edges, and the more kindly parts remain. It's what allows villages to endure." They spoke of small things for a while. Garden pests, a new family moving into a cottage near the schoolhouse, the choir's plans for Easter hymns. But as she was leaving, Beatrice touched Miss Marple's arm. "I never did thank you properly," she said quietly. "Not just for finding the truth, but for doing it in a way that left enough dignity for those still here. That matters." Miss Marple inclined her head. "We must all live together after the fact, my dear. Justice is necessary, but so is the manner in which it's done." In the following days, Miss Marple noticed subtle changes in certain relationships. Miss Lark and Evelyn walked together to the green more often, the girl now carrying herself with the confidence of one who has been believed when it mattered. Mr. Penrose remained polite and efficient on the fete committee, but no longer pushed himself to the center of every decision. Perhaps a lesson learned from coming too near disaster. Even Mrs. Price, who had recounted her figure in the Lane story so many times, had finally begun to let the subject rest, turning her energies instead to a renewed campaign about the poor state of the village notice board. One afternoon, as Miss Marple was trimming the early roses in her front garden, Horace Fletcher stopped by, his arms full of lanterns from the church stores. "We're airing them ahead of time this year," he said. "No sense leaving them shut up until the week of the fete. Thought you might like to see they're all in good order." Miss Marple examined them one by one, her eyes lingering a moment on the blue lantern. Its brass crown had been polished, the glass cleaned until it shone. To anyone else, it looked like nothing more than a handsome old piece of parish property. "It's quite restored to respectability," she said. Fletcher chuckled. "And this time, it'll be locked away between uses, with me holding the only key." "That is wise," Miss Marple said. But privately, she thought that no lock, however strong, could guard against the cleverness of those determined to hide something in plain sight. On the Sunday before Easter, she attended the morning service. The church was full, sunlight streaming through the stained glass, dust motes swirling in the warm air. The choir sang with bright voices, and Evelyn's clear soprano rose above them, unforced and pure. During the final hymn, Miss Marple's gaze drifted upward to the tower, the lantern room invisible from within the nave. She pictured its empty floor, the quiet air up there, holding only the scent of polish and old wood, and felt a certain satisfaction in knowing it had been returned to its intended purpose, a place for harmless tradition, not for secrets that could kill. After the service, Briggs joined her for a short walk toward her cottage. "You'll be glad to know," he said. Mrs. Carter's trial concluded quickly. The confession, the letters, Evelyn's statement, they made the matter clear. She's been given a term in prison, and she won't be returning here. Miss Marple nodded. "And Penrose?" "No charges. The bishop gave him a stern talking to about meddling, and I think that was punishment enough for his sort." They parted at her gate, Briggs tipping his hat in that slightly awkward way he had when expressing gratitude. The days grew warmer. The fete committee, newly cautious, decided to keep the lantern room display modest this year. No elaborate arrangements, no late-night opening. Still, on the evening itself, the green filled with the hum of conversation, the clink of teacups, the scent of sponge cake and jam tarts. Lanterns swayed gently in the breeze, their colors glowing as the sun sank. Miss Marple attended for a short while, standing near the tea tent and watching the children run with their paper lanterns, faces lit with the same innocence as before. She noticed how the villagers now looked toward the tower without any flicker of unease, how the new lock glinted faintly in the dying light. As the first stars appeared, she made her way home along the quiet lane, the sound of laughter and music fading behind her. In the stillness, she thought again of the rector, his trusting nature, his care for his parish, and the way both had been used against him. She thought, too, of how quickly trust could be lost and how much longer it took to rebuild. At her garden gate, she paused, listening to the faint murmur of the fete in the distance. A high lantern hung from her own porch, its warm light spilling over the path. She smiled to herself, not at the mystery solved, but at the knowledge that life in St. Aldhelm's, with all its quirks and dangers, had resumed its familiar pattern. Inside, she set the kettle on and took her knitting from its basket. There would be other puzzles, other moments when the surface of village life rippled in ways others failed to see. For now, though, she was content to let the evening close in, the lamplight pooling gently on the table, and the peace of her cottage settling around her like a well-worn shawl. The lantern room would keep its silent watch over the green, and the village would carry on, gossiping, mending, quarreling, forgiving, just as it always had. The Easter fete had come and gone, leaving the green strewn with a faint confetti of trampled petals and paper streamers. A warm April rain had followed the celebration, rinsing the streets clean and drawing out that peculiar, fresh scent of wet earth and budding hedgerows. St. Aldhelm's had, to all outward appearances, regained its composure. But in Miss Marple's mind, one small thread remained untied. The murder had been solved in the eyes of the law. Mrs. Carter's confession, Evelyn's account, and the recovered letters had sealed it neatly enough. But Miss Marple's instinct told her there was still something missing, a small but telling truth about what had happened in those minutes in the lantern room before the rector fell. She had been patient. Weeks had passed, giving everyone time to let down their guard. And it was in that calm, almost idle lull that the last piece had fallen into place, delivered, as so often, by accident. It came in the form of a remark from Evelyn, overheard while Miss Marple was visiting Miss Lark's garden. The girl, watering a row of spring lettuces, said innocently, "It's funny, you know. I thought Mrs. Carter was wearing her white gloves when she went up the tower. But when I saw her later that night, her hands were bare. And there was something red on one of them, like paint." Miss Marple, bending to admire a hyacinth, did not let her surprise show. She thanked Evelyn and took her leave soon after, her mind now humming with certainty. That evening, she called on Briggs. Mrs. Carter struck the blow. "Yes," she said once they were alone, but not with the lantern in her hands. Briggs frowned. "You've lost me, Miss Marple." The lantern was in the room already. Penrose had carried it up earlier. Mrs. Carter went to the rector with the intention of persuading him to hand over the papers. But when persuasion failed, she turned to something closer at hand. Briggs leaned forward. "What?" "The bell cleat, Constable. You recall it had a smear of soot or oil on the edge. The cleat was loose that night and heavy. She wrenched it free and struck him with it. It left no broken glass to explain, and she could replace it quickly before summoning Penrose. The red Evelyn saw on her hand was not paint, but a smear of rust mixed with blood. She must have removed her gloves then, to avoid leaving a trace on them." Briggs exhaled slowly, the picture settling in his mind. "It fits. And she never mentioned touching the bell rope that night." "Because," Miss Marple said gently, "she wanted us to believe the bell ringing had been the summons to the rector, not the signal afterwards." Penrose tied the rope in his own neat way, masking the truth entirely. Briggs gave a short, almost reluctant laugh. "You do have a way of finding the last stitch, don't you? It is only a matter of looking where the cloth puckers," Miss Marple said, smiling. The matter was closed for her then, not because it would change the course of justice, but because the final picture was now complete in her own mind. Mrs. Carter's fear, Penrose's misplaced loyalty, the rector's fatal trust. They had all played their part, but it was the small, human reflexes, like removing a pair of gloves in haste, that had given the truth away. A week later, the lantern room was opened again for inspection by the new committee. Miss Marple was invited, though she stayed mostly in the background, watching as dust sheets were lifted and the colored glass caught the afternoon sun. The room smelled only of polish and fresh air now. The floorboards were swept clean, and the blue lantern hung in its accustomed place, harmless at last. She stood a while at the diamond-paned window, looking down over the green. Children darted about, their voices rising in carefree shouts. The sight made her smile. It struck her, as it always did at the close of such affairs, how quickly life could turn from tragedy back to its ordinary rhythms. The village would keep its watch on the lantern room for a time, but eventually even that vigilance would fade. Human nature, she thought, is far better at remembering the comfort of familiar routines than the dangers that once hid in them. Still, she would remember, and should the bells ever toll unexpectedly again, she would listen, not only for the sound itself, but for the silences that came before and after. For it was in those silences that the truth had lived, waiting for someone with the patience to hear it. She turned from the window, satisfied at last, and made her way down the narrow stairs into the bright, ordinary day.